Good evening, America. Tonight we begin with breaking news from the Southern Front. News that military analysts across Europe and the United States are calling one of the most revealing armored engagements of this entire war. Because for the first time since the invasion began, Russia's most prized battlefield asset, the T-90M, the tank Moscow paraded as invincible, untouchable, and superior to anything the West could ever field, finally met the machines it was designed to defeat. And what unfolded next was not what the Kremlin promised. In the fields outside Zaporizhzhia, under a sky thick with smoke and drone reconnaissance, Russian T-90Ms rolled forward expecting dominance. Instead, they ran directly into Ukrainian armored units equipped with Western-supplied M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 tanks. Tanks built on a completely different philosophy of engineering, survivability, and precision. Analysts are already calling this clash a turning point. A moment that strips away years of Russian military propaganda and lays bare the truth that modern warfare rarely behaves the way its architects imagine. Because the T-90M, the tank Russia branded as a symbol of technological supremacy, did not perform as advertised, not even close. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't supposed to happen, yet it did, spectacularly, publicly, and with consequences that are already sending shockwaves through Moscow's strategic planning rooms. So, how did we get here? And why does this battle matter so much? Let's step back and start from the beginning. The stage is set. How this battle became inevitable. To understand how this clash became inevitable, we have to rewind the clock several weeks, to a moment when satellite imagery intercepted communications, and OSAT analysts began noticing something unusual along the Russian lines near Zaporizhzhia. Russian railheads were suddenly receiving new armored shipments. Fuel depots were being expanded. Artillery tubes were repositioned in dense clusters, and in camouflage staging areas carved out of tree lines, analysts spotted the unmistakable shape of Russia's T-90M tanks, held in reserve for months, now being moved toward the front. Russia believed its moment had come. With enough armor, enough artillery, and enough raw firepower, the Kremlin was convinced it could finally punch a hole through Ukrainian defenses in the south. Numerical advantage, they thought, would do the rest. But Ukraine saw something entirely different. Ukrainian commanders watching the same satellite feeds recognized an opportunity, a chance to test Western armor under real combat conditions. Abrams and Leopards had been integrated quietly, methodically, with crews training day and night. Ukraine knew this confrontation was coming, and it prepared for it with a level of discipline Russia simply did not anticipate. Let that sink in. This clash was months in the making. While Moscow imagined a sweeping armored breakthrough, Ukraine envisioned a controlled battlefield, one where terrain, optics, and precision gunnery could neutralize Russia's advantage in numbers. And that brings us to the myth Russia was counting on the belief that the T-90M was untouchable. Let's take a closer look at that myth, and why it mattered so much. The myth of the T-90M's Russia's crown jewel of armor. To understand why this battle stunned so many analysts, you have to understand the mythology Russia built around the T-90M, the tank the Kremlin marketed as the crown jewel of its armored forces. For years, Russian state media portrayed the T-90M as the pinnacle of modern engineering. They boasted about its superior armor composites, claiming it could withstand Western sabot rounds. They highlighted its built-in active protection systems, insisting these systems could intercept incoming missiles before they struck. They showcased its upgraded fire control system, modern, precision-based, digitally enhanced, they said, supposedly giving Russian gunners the ability to acquire and strike targets faster than any NATO tank on the battlefield. And they praised its autoloader mechanism, describing it as faster, more efficient, more lethal. That was the sales pitch. But claims don't win battles. Performance does. And when the T-90M finally rolled into a real, large-scale confrontation against Abrams and Leopard tanks, the battlefield exposed something Russian television never acknowledged. The armor didn't hold the way Moscow promised. The active protection systems didn't intercept the threats they were designed to stop. The fire control system, supposedly superior, struggled at long-range engagements. And the autoloader, that celebrated engineering shortcut, remained tied to a design flaw that has haunted Russian tanks for decades: ammunition stored in the crew compartment. What Russian TV advertised vs what the battlefield exposed. Two very different stories. And this is the part Moscow fears the most. Because when the myth collapses, so does the intimidation factor that Russia relies on. So now that we've stripped away the propaganda, let's turn to the other side of the battlefield, the philosophy behind Western tanks, and why their design choices matter so profoundly in real combat. The Western tank philosophy. Why Abrams and Leopards are differently. To understand why this armored clash unfolded the way it did, we have to step into the minds of Western engineers. Because Abrams and Leopard tanks aren't just machines. They are the physical expression of an entire philosophy of warfare, a philosophy that diverges sharply from Russia's. Where Russian tank design prioritizes compact silhouettes, aggressive maneuvering, and cost-efficient mass production, Western tanks are built around one principle above all else: crew survivability. Everything begins there. The armor is thicker, the internal layout is cleaner. The ammunition is stored in a separate, isolated compartment with blowout panels. So if the tank is hit, the crew has a fighting chance to live. Then there's fire control precision. Abrams and Leopards integrate advanced thermal sights, laser rangefinders, and ballistic computers that allow gunners to hit targets at long distances. accurately, reliably, and often on the first shot. And, crucially, these tanks are engineered to fire while moving, thanks to sophisticated stabilization systems. Western doctrine doesn't require a tank to stop before shooting. It demands lethality even on the move. All of this makes Western tanks larger, heavier, and slower to deploy than their Russian counterparts. But they are also vastly more survivable and dramatically more effective when used correctly. Russian tanks compact, aggressive, but fragile. Western tanks heavier, deliberate, built to keep crews alive. Two philosophies, two worlds, two visions of mechanized warfare. And then the battlefield provided the truth test. Because when these philosophies finally collided on the open fields of southern Ukraine, everything Moscow promised, everything it claimed, was about to be challenged in real time. Let's go to the moment when steel met steel and reality replaced theory. The first clash, and suddenly everything changed. When the first wave of Russian armor began its advance, Ukrainian commanders instantly recognized the tactics. It was a classic Soviet-style formation, tight columns of T-90 MEs supported by armored infantry vehicles, all moving forward under the protective boom of artillery. This was the breakthrough doctrine Russia had relied on for decades, overwhelmed defenders with sheer momentum and firepower. And on paper, it should have worked. Russia believed that once these tanks began rolling, Ukraine would have little choice but to fall back. But the battlefield had other plans. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, already in the air, tracked every movement. Thermal signatures revealed the direction of the assault long before the tanks came into visual range. And waiting across the fields, dug in, hidden, and perfectly positioned, were the crews of Abrams and Leopard tanks who had trained specifically for this moment. The range closed, the Russian formation tightened. And then, in an instant, the clash began. Ukrainian gunners locked onto the leading T-90 MEs and fired from distances where Western optics thrive and Russian optics struggle. The result was immediate first-round hits, devastating hits, the kind that change the tone of a battle before it fully begins. Several T-90 MEs erupted in flame. Others jerked to a halt, their tracks blown out, their crews scrambling for survival. Russia expected domination. Reality delivered humiliation, because instead of a sweeping armored breakthrough, the T-90 MEs never even got close enough to use their supposed advantages. They were being dismantled at range, precisely where Western tanks are designed to excel. And here's where things get explosive. That first volley wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Because as Russian commanders scrambled to adapt, Ukraine's armored units were already shifting, repositioning, and preparing for the next phase, a phase that would expose even deeper weaknesses in Russia's prized tanks. Let's move into what happened next when Russia tried to fight back. Long-range accuracy. The technology Russia couldn't counter. What unfolded next on that battlefield wasn't random. It wasn't luck. And it certainly wasn't coincidence. It was engineering. The kind of engineering Western militaries have spent decades perfecting. Because once the first shots were fired, the advantage of Abrams and Leopard tanks became impossible to ignore. Their thermal sights allowed Ukrainian crews to see clearly through smoke, distance, and battlefield haze long before Russian gunners could acquire a stable target. Their laser rangefinders fed data into ballistic computers that calculated the perfect firing solution in milliseconds. When movement, distance, elevation, all of it automatically accounted for. And the stabilization systems, they let these tanks fire while moving at speed, maintaining accuracy Russia simply could not match. Western doctrine demands lethality in motion. Russian tanks, by comparison, often need to halt before making an accurate shot. Here's the part that stunned analysts. Ukrainian crews had only been training on these Western tanks for a matter of months. Russian crews, on the other hand, had years of experience on their platforms, and yet the Ukrainians outperformed them, decisively. Weapons built for precision vs tanks built for mass. Two competing philosophies. And on this battlefield, precision won. Every time a T-90M tried to close the distance, Ukrainian gunners hit them first. And when they hit, the damage was catastrophic. Russia's best operators found themselves on the losing end of engagements they were supposed to dominate. This wasn't luck, it was engineering. But Russia wasn't done yet. Commanders quickly recognized their long-range disadvantage and began adjusting their tactics, desperate to regain momentum. Let's look at how they tried to adapt, and why even those adjustments weren't enough. Russia tries to adapt smoke terrain, suppression fire. Realizing their tanks were being dismantled at long range, Russian commanders scrambled to adapt, and on paper, their adjustments made sense. They ordered smoke screens to break Ukrainian lines of sight, hoping to blind the thermal optics long enough for T-90 MEs to close the distance. They shifted tanks through low-terrain depressions, trying to use the land itself as a shield. And they called in coordinated suppression fire, artillery barrages meant to pin Ukrainian crews down and disrupt their firing rhythm. For a moment, it looked like a competent adjustment. For a moment. But the fundamental problems didn't go away, they intensified. Russia's smoke cover, meant to obscure the battlefield, had the opposite effect when viewed through Western thermal sights. Abrams and Leopard optics cut straight through it, revealing every movement with stunning clarity. What Russian commanders thought would conceal their advance instead highlighted it. Their attempts to rush into close range also backfired. The T-90M's fire control system, far less sophisticated, struggled to maintain accuracy while moving. Ukrainian tanks, meanwhile, stayed lethal even at full speed, hitting targets before Russian gunners could stabilize their sights. And the biggest weakness remained the most deadly ammunition stored inside the crew compartment. Each time a T-90M was hit, the risk of catastrophic explosion loomed over its entire crew. A vulnerability baked into the design itself, impossible to fix in the heat of battle. A competent adjustment, but not enough. Because no matter what tactics Russia attempted, they couldn't escape the engineering realities of their own machines. And then came the moment Russian commanders feared. The moment when these vulnerabilities turned catastrophic in front of their entire formation. Let's go there. Catastrophic kills. The T-90M's fatal weakness exposed, and this is where the battle turned from difficult to devastating for Russian forces. Because once Ukrainian gunners began landing consistent hits, a fatal design flaw inside the T-90M revealed itself. A flaw so deeply embedded in Russian tank philosophy that no amount of tactics, smoke, or artillery could hide it. Russian tanks store their ammunition inside the same compartment as the crew. That means when a sabot round penetrates the armor, even partially, it doesn't just disable the tank. It ignites the propellant charges sitting inches from the crew's legs. What follows is what military analysts call a cook-off, an instantaneous, violent chain reaction where ammunition detonates inside the hull. One hit, one spark, and the entire tank becomes a fireball. There is no time for escape, no chance for survival. On the battlefield near Zaporizhia, multiple T-90Ms suffered these catastrophic kills. Turrets were blown skyward. Hulls collapsed inward from the pressure. And crews, some of Russia's most experienced, were lost instantly. Not because they lacked training, not because they made mistakes, but because of the design of their tank. Western tanks, by contrast, store ammunition in isolated compartments with blowout panels engineered specifically to vent explosions away from the crew. It's the difference between a survivable hit and a death sentence. Survivability vs. sacrifice. Two doctrines, two outcomes. And as these catastrophic losses mounted, imagine being inside a Russian command bunker, listening to reports come in that the very tanks you promised would dominate the battlefield were evaporating on impact. That's the moment panic begins to replace confidence. Let's break down what happened next as commanders realized just how bad the numbers were becoming. The numbers Russia didn't want released when the smoke began to clear and battlefield analysts compiled the first damage assessments. The numbers told a story more damning than any Ukrainian statement or Western report ever could. According to multiple independent sources, Russia lost more than half of the T-90Ms it committed to the operation. Not damaged, not temporarily disabled, lost. Many destroyed so violently that recovery teams couldn't even identify full turret fragments. And these weren't reserve tanks. These were elite units, the machines Moscow had showcased as the pride of its armored corps. Meanwhile, Ukraine's losses told a very different story. A handful of Abrams and Leopard tanks were hit, yes, but most were recoverable. Crews survived. Vehicles were towed, repaired, and in some cases returned to the fight. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Russia outnumbered Ukraine, yet still lost. Russia had artillery superiority, yet still lost. Russia chose the battlefield, the timing, and the moment of engagement, and still lost. These numbers changed everything. Because when a nation commits its most advanced armored vehicles to a single decisive operation and walks away with more than half of them destroyed, the implications go far beyond one battlefield or one day of fighting. Suddenly, questions erupt inside command bunkers. Doubt spreads among crews preparing for the next operation. Confidence evaporates at every level of the chain of command. And behind those statistics lies something even heavier, something more human. The cost paid by the men inside those tanks. Let's talk about that. The human cost, crews, families, and the reality of war. Behind the numbers, behind the destroyed steel and burned-out hulls, lies the part of this story that rarely makes headlines. The human cost. Many of the Russian tank crews sent into this assault were young men, barely in their 20s. Some had been told the T-90M would protect them from anything the battlefield could throw their way. They believed the armor around them was enough. They believed the state that built it had done its job. But when those tanks ignited from the inside, when ammunition detonated inches from their bodies, there was no escape. Their lives ended in an instant, without warning, without a chance to flee, without the protections Western crews rely on. On the other side of the battlefield, Ukrainian tankers faced hits too, but their tanks were built differently. Blowout panels vented explosions away. Crew compartments stayed intact. Men survived, shaken, injured, but alive. And in many cases, they went home to their families. Technology decides fate, but humans pay the price. And whether a soldier wears Ukrainian patches or Russian insignia, the fear is the same, the fear of being trapped inside a vehicle that becomes a furnace. Families on both sides wait for news, some praying for recovery, others preparing to grieve. War is fought by machines but suffered by people. And that suffering forces militaries to confront a difficult question. If this is what happened in one engagement, what does it mean for the operations that must follow? Let's look at the operational implications Russia now faces. Operational shockwaves. What this battle reveals about the war, what happened in this single armored engagement, didn't stay on that battlefield. Its impact rippled outward, through command reports, intelligence briefings, and the morale of forces on both sides. Because when Russia committed its elite T-90M units, the tanks it claimed would rewrite the momentum of the war, The expectation in Moscow was clear: these machines would break through, overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, and demonstrate Russian superiority. Instead, the opposite happened. Russia's best armor proved insufficient, not just tactically, but fundamentally. The vulnerabilities long discussed by Western analysts weren't theoretical anymore. They were playing out in real time, in fireballs visible from drones overhead. Russian commanders suddenly had to confront a reality they had spent 2 years trying to deny: their most advanced equipment could not achieve dominance against a well-trained opponent using Western technology. Ukraine, meanwhile, achieved something far more significant than a defensive victory. It validated the integration of Western tanks, not just politically, not just symbolically, but operationally. Abrams and Leopards didn't just survive the battle, they shaped it. They controlled range, dictated tempo, and forced Russia to react rather than advance. That kind of tactical dominance has psychological consequences. Russian crews, hearing what happened, now know that stepping into a T-90M is not a guarantee of survival. They know that Ukrainian gunners can hit them before they can even acquire a target. They know that their armor might not protect them, and that their ammunition could turn their vehicle into a coffin. Propaganda collapses when reality arrives. And this is where the world starts paying attention. Not just military analysts, but governments, alliances, and foreign ministries. Because what this battle revealed doesn't just affect the front line. It affects the geopolitical balance far beyond Ukraine. Let's talk about that. Strategic fallout, what this means for NATO, Ukraine, and Russia's future. The strategic consequences of this battle extend far beyond the shattered remains of T-90Ms on a Ukrainian field. In Brussels, London, Washington, and Berlin, military planners are now dissecting the engagement frame by frame. Because for NATO, this wasn't just a Ukrainian victory. It was a real-world stress test of Western equipment against Russia's most advanced armor. And the results were unmistakable. Abrams and Leopards didn't just perform well, they performed decisively. They validated decades of Western doctrine emphasizing survivability, precision, and integration over mass production and brute force. For NATO governments debating the political risk of sending more tanks, more armored vehicles, more firepower, this battle provided exactly the reassurance they needed. Western systems work exactly as designed, and they change battlefield outcomes. Russia, meanwhile, is facing the opposite reality. Its leadership must now confront the uncomfortable truth that its premier tank cannot achieve the breakthroughs its doctrine relies on. T-90M units were supposed to be Russia's answer to Western armor. The machines that would neutralize Abrams and Leopards, restore momentum, and intimidate the West into hesitation. Instead, Russia proved the West right. Western engineering, Western training, Western doctrine. All of it outperformed the Kremlin's best effort. And that means Russia must now rethink everything: its armored strategy, its production priorities, its belief that mass can substitute for quality, and its assumption that Western weapons are too complex or fragile to dominate in real combat. This changes the balance of modern warfare. Because once you demonstrate in open battle that one military system can reliably defeat another, the implications echo through defense ministries, budgets, alliances, and war plans for years. Now let's bring all of this together into the broader story this battle is telling. Final synthesis. The battle that exposed the truth. When you step back and look at everything this single engagement revealed, the picture becomes unmistakably clear. Technology matters, training matters, doctrine matters. And when the moment of truth arrives, when steel meets steel and propaganda collides with physics, the battlefield strips away every illusion. Russia promised the world a tank that could outgun, outrun, and outlast anything the West could provide. It promised superiority. It promised dominance. It promised inevitability. But what the world witnessed was something entirely different. Ukrainian tank crews, trained for only months on systems built over decades of Western engineering, outperformed Russia's elite operators. Western armor not only survived, it dictated the entire shape of the battle. Precision defeated mass, survivability defeated spectacle, doctrine defeated mythology. This clash didn't just expose the weaknesses of the T-90M. It exposed the gap between what Russia claims to be and what it actually is under fire. A turning point. Yes, a revelation. Absolutely, a warning shot for future operations, without question. And yet, the story isn't over. Because the battlefield is still shifting, Russia is still searching for answers, and Ukraine is still integrating the tools that may define the next phase of this war. Let's look ahead at what comes next. Cliffhanger ending. What happens next? So where does this battle leave us? Because if one thing is certain, it's that Russia cannot continue fighting this war with the doctrine it brought into it. The loss of so many T-90Ms, its most advanced and protected tanks, forces Moscow to confront painful truths. Its armor strategy must change, its assumptions must change, and its commanders must now plan for a battlefield where Western systems routinely outperform their own. Meanwhile, in NATO capitals, the conversation is shifting. This clash didn't just validate Abrams and Leopards. It strengthened the case for sending more armor, more training, more integration. Western nations see clearly now Ukraine can use these tools effectively, decisively, and responsibly, and that will almost certainly shape future aid packages. On the ground in Ukraine, confidence is growing. Victories like this don't just affect maps. They affect morale, planning, and resolve. They give commanders proof that their strategies work. They give soldiers hope that this war can still be pushed toward a just outcome. But there's a darker side too. Defeat for Russia here may spark desperation. and desperation shapes wars. The next weeks may determine everything, and we'll be here to break it down, step by step, as the story continues to unfold.